Welcome back, friend of quiet stories. Settle in, slow your breathing, and let the city of ice begin to form around you. St. Petersburg in the deep hours before dawn, when sound travels like glass and the sky is a pale, waiting slate. You feel the cold first. It comes through the boards of a creaking pier on the Neva, through the fur at your collar, through your gloves as you rest a hand on the railing and listen. Somewhere upriver, oars knock softly against a boat's hull. Somewhere within the palace quarter, a watchman stamps his feet, blows on his fingers, and turns the key in a lantern door. Your breath is a small cloud that drifts and vanishes. Across the water rises the long, green and white front of the Winter Palace, vast, ceremonious, almost theatrical, and yet inside that grandeur lie rooms few ever see. The palace that Catherine inherited was the public face of empire, Rastrelli's monumental enfilades, ceilings with gilded stucco curling like frost itself, doorways tall enough to swallow an army of courtiers. It dazzled by design, but Catherine, who signed decrees at a pace that made secretaries reach for more sand to blot the ink, required something other than spectacle to govern. She needed privacy, control, and the ability to move unnoticed from one labor of the day to the next. So, behind the staterooms lay another palace, a sequence of small apartments, libraries, cabinets, service stairs, and warmed passages that let a sovereign live and work without the parade. A sleigh skims past the Admiralty Tower and comes to rest at a side entrance. Boots whisper on the steps, doors open, then close with a padded thump. Within, the scent is a blend of beeswax, drying felt, singed wick, and the faint perfume of resin from stoves. The floors are warm inlaid wood. On the paneling, pale silk catches what little light there is. Now, switch your vantage gently into third person, and watch the corridors that belong to the waking of a court. Footmen in livery pass with lamps shaded in green. A maid of honor balances a lacquer tray with correspondence. A chamberlain rehearses names for the morning audiences under his breath. To the left, a door appears to be a wall, its seams concealed within the paneling's geometry. It opens onto a narrow stair that curves away from the state route and toward the sovereign's private morning. No legends here of dungeons and trick fireplaces, despite what later gossip preferred. These hidden rooms were deliberate, practical, and, by 18th century standards, unsurprising. Intimate cabinets for reading or prayer, closets for portfolios and maps, galleries hung with Dutch landscapes and Italian skies, and service corridors that kept the machinery of court. Firewood, tea, ink, even news flowing invisibly. Some details can be named from inventories and architectural plans. Others must be inferred from surviving fabric and parallel palaces of the age. Where the record is silent, we move carefully, noting the silence. Catherine's mornings, when she was not traveling, often began early. She valued the hours before the drums of ceremony. At a small table set near a window, the panes etched with hoarfrost like fernwork, she broke the red wax on packets from governors and diplomats, and from philosophers whose books she had brought north into the snow. Voltaire's wit had a way of warming a room. Diderot's pages could make one hear the clatter of Paris, even here at the edge of the Baltic. A secretary read summaries in a low voice. Catherine drew a pencil line under a clause, added a question in French in the margin, and sealed a reply with a firm, unhurried hand. The palace beyond the door remained motionless, as if still painted on the river's air. But inside the smaller world of the private apartments, life had texture. A porcelain cup left a perfect ring on a leather blotter. A clock ticked against the rhythm of the snow outside. The Empress's spaniel, nose dusted with ash, returned from investigating a stove door and settled at her feet. An usher, moving through a service passage that ran behind the wall, received a nod from a senior valet and disappeared again, the light on his lamp foxing on gold leaf. As daylight lifted, the sovereign would sometimes cross, by warmed corridor and interior bridge, to the buildings that would come to be called the Hermitage. The word itself spoke her intention. Hermitage, a hermit's retreat, a place for solitude. There, away from the thicket of courtiers, she could walk among canvases, glance up at the Thames under a Dutch sky, or study the grain of a carved frame whose corners the firelight made into small suns. The making of that refuge, the collections, the architecture, the ingenious devices that spared her the constant presence of servants, belongs to our later parts. For now, we remain close to the morning rooms, close to the place where power met paper and the empire's pulse could be felt in a single quiet hour. Listen, the palace is waking. In the grand staircase hall, a broom's straw whispers over stone. In the guard room, a saber's scabbard knocks the leg of a chair. In a small cabinet hidden within the grid of the wall, a case is unlocked. Inside lies a map of the empire whose edges seem to curl like the river's ice breaking in spring. A knock. Not the ceremonial 3, but the softer pattern that signals a trusted aid. What lies beyond the panel that looks like a bookcase is no legend at all, merely the practical secret of a working court. But when the latch turns and the hinge breathes, the space it reveals will change the way you imagine how Catherine ruled. A narrow passage that leads, not to darkness, but to a room where the table rises without a servant crossing the threshold. Day has climbed the river. The Winter Palace stands fully awake now, its long face to the Neva washed in that unmistakable livery, green, white, and glints of gold leaf that catch at any scrap of sun. Transport sledges rasp along the embankment. A fish seller calls with a voice made bright by the cold. A pair of officers cross the square with their sabers lifted so the tips don't click on the stone. From across the water, the building looks like ceremony made solid. Yet to those who know it, the facade is both mask and instrument. Rastrelli wrote it in generous rhythms. Paired columns, long cornices, and windows stacked in formal alignments that unspool toward the river's horizon. Color is part of the rhetoric. Green warms a northerly light. White answers the snow with cleanliness when thaw turns streets to slate. Gold declares, without apology, that rule here expects to be seen. Painters return in summer, with scaffolds and brushes. Crisply drawn moldings refuse to blur even in damp weather. The palace's face is performance architecture, an argument in lime, chalk, and gilded leaf. But Catherine did not live by spectacle alone. She inherited the great front, and then set about building a private geography to twin it. The small Hermitage first, like a bridge of galleries. The great Hermitage later, lengthening the riverside. And, in time, a theater where music could turn a dark season into light. The public facade promised infinity. The adjacent structures promised the opposite: containment, thought, the privilege of walking among canvases with no courtiers pressing behind her shoulder. If you stood by the embankment in the late 1760s and watched a morning gather, the two worlds would meet in the churn of sleigh runners. Courtiers and petitioners streamed to the main entrance under the crowned double-headed eagle. Merchants' sledges offloaded crates whose straw steamed. Clerks carried portfolios hugged against their coats. The smell braided horse, wet felt, pine resin from stove wood, the iron breath of the river, and a throat-clearing trace of perfume. The facade amplified and disciplined the crowd's gaze into lanes and pauses. Behind those doors, the geometry that looks effortless from outside becomes an intricate game of turns. Enfilades, rooms aligned like a telescope, draw visitors along ceremonial axes. Between those grand lines lie smaller diagonals where business truly flows. Short passages, service lobbies, and tight stairs that let attendants appear and vanish like stagehands. In one newly raised pavilion, a warm gallery serves as a circulatory spine. In another, a glazed passage carries light like liquid through short days. Catherine understood facades as language. She had come to Russia a foreign bride, and, through risk and resolve, become sovereign. Stone now spoke for her. When envoys approached along the Neva, the palace set the tone before the first bow. When crowds met there for festivals or for soldiers' oaths in deep winter, the building supplied the stage and the vocabulary of loyalty. The face said, "The empire is continuous. Decisions made in private rooms reach unbroken to the river's edge." And yet she would not be trapped by her own grandeur. Side portals marked only by discreet crests pull you off the public axis and into the smaller universe that suited her hours. Rooms of moderate size, ceilings low enough to gather warmth, walls paneled and hung with Dutch skies, Italian light, and the sober glazes of northern still life. Inventory books record paintings arriving from Paris and Amsterdam. Crates from Berlin yield carved tables and marble busts. A ledger notes a mechanism for a table that could rise through a hatch without a servant crossing the threshold. Consider the soundscape from inside a deep window, the muffled clop of hooves on packed snow, the distant crack of a flag, sled runners shrilling as they round the Admiralty corner, the nearer rustle of paper as a chamberlain amends the day's list by hand. A stove door ticks as metal cools, ice feathers and vanishes where heat meets glass. The color outside is not just paint. It warms the reflection on polished floorboards, turns silk faintly green at the edges, and makes gold leaf hum even when the sky refuses a sun. Because facades also protect. In a northern winter, wind can make a mockery of pride. The mass of the palace, thick walls, deep-set windows, galleries arranged like windbreaks, stoves nested like heart and lungs, allows a sovereign life in a climate that tests everything. The facade takes the first blow. The hidden rooms turn punishment into quiet. On days when the Neva groans under a hard crust and sledges race with runners screeching, the private apartments keep a climate of paper, conversation, and steady temperature of thought. By late morning, the showside begins its appointed choreography. Audiences, signatures, the mathematics of precedence. While just out of sight, the other business continues. Servants move along warm passages with the steadiness of a tide. A restorer warms a knife to lift a loose veneer on a marquetry table. A librarian, entrusted with a new volume, breathes on his fingers before he opens the packet. A machinist descends to test the pulleys and counterweights that make a certain dining table rise to the exact height of a quiet meal. From the embankment, a passerby might look up and see a silhouette pause at a second-story window, only a shift of shadow against green and white. Perhaps the Empress, perhaps not. The city tells stories either way. The palace has learned to speak in controlled ambiguities. Now we turn from the face to the roots that make the face possible, the invisible paths by which heat, messages, and food slip through the structure without touching the stage. A panel that reads as bookcase opens inward with the softest sigh, and the corridor beyond is warmer than you would expect. Step off the ceremonial axis and the palace changes scale. The gilded stucco falls away, the ceilings lower, voices soften as if wrapped in felt. Here, behind the wall that reads like a bookcase, the air is warmer and smells of beeswax, birch smoke, and clean linen. Lamps are shaded in green to protect eyes and parchments. Footfalls are practical leather, not parade heels. If the facade is the palace's grammar, these passages are its verbs: carry, warm, fetch, return. A corridor runs like a capillary behind the grand enfilade, skirting stoves set into thick masonry. At regular intervals, doors open to narrow service stairs that coil between floors. Heat breathes through ceramic Dutch stoves, tiled in blue and white with tiny skaters and windmills. A fashionable import that also happens to work. Ash is whisked away down iron chutes. New billets of birch are stacked where a hand will find them in the dark of a winter dawn. When a valve is turned and the draft draws, a thread of warmth pulls through the wall and into a reception room that must never show the mechanics of its comfort. Listen to the palace's backstage music. Soft clinks of porcelain packed in straw. The distant regular tick of a long case clock that marks the tempo of errands. The papery whisper of inventories being copied by a clerk who warms his fingers over a stove vent between lines. Polite invisibility is an art here. Servants learn to move like river water, steady, directional, seldom noticed unless they flood. A senior valet times the circulation so that a tray crosses a threshold as conversation naturally pauses. A housekeeper keeps a map of the building in her head, not in ink. Where the daylight falls shortest, where drafts lurk, which door latches need a touch of soap to quiet. The corridor kinks around a masonry mass and opens into a small lobby with cupboards labeled in a tidy hand. Candles, sand, spare wicks, sealing wax. Beside them, a locked cabinet for china, repair, holding glue of fish and isinglass and tiny clamps for mending a chipped saucer without a trace. Past it, a carpenter's nook, planes laid like instruments, shavings curled on the floor like pale ribbons. He fits a new tread on a stair by eye and thumb, testing for the one note of silence that a good step must make under a careful foot. Not all the apparatus is humble. Here and there, the corridor hides contrivances that would have pleased an engineer. A dumbwaiter shaft boxed in oak, its ropes hissing softly as a crank turns in the pantry below. A lever that unlatches a door from the far side of a wall so that a tray can appear as if from the paneling itself. Contemporary accounts and later guidebooks speak of ingenious mechanical devices that spared diners the constant presence of servants in a small suite Catherine used for private meals. The specifics vary between tellings, and not every drawing survives, but enough records remain, bills, descriptions, traces in the floor structure, that we can say this much without romance. Hidden routes and lifting tables existed to make privacy workable in a palace. Turn again, and you are in a passage with two lives. On one side, doors open to public rooms, gilded, echoing, meant for rank. On the other, a narrower row of doors leads to cabinets where business can be done without audience. The paint is darker here to hide scuffs. Hooks hold winter cloaks. A tray rests ready with square sheets of blotting sand. The corridor slopes almost imperceptibly. Architects learned that a gentle fall toward service courts helps snowmelt go where it should. Somewhere close by, water from the Neva, hauled and strained, warms in copper urns for tea. At an elbow in the passage, a messenger waits with his cap in his hands. He has arrived by a route that avoided the main staircase and the ceremony of guards. Back gate, inner yard, scullery court that smells of rye crust and onion, then this artery that ends beneath a door, whose seams the gilded guests will never notice. The packet under his arm bears red wax and the impress of a provincial seal. The paper is thick and rough to the touch. When the door opens, he steps forward and bows without words, for here time is measured in signatures, not speeches. These corridors also carry news in the less official sense. Who has returned from Moscow with a new French coat? Which violinist fell ill during rehearsal? That a crate has arrived from Amsterdam, smelling faintly of damp hemp, containing landscapes where the light seems to come from another latitude. News moves in murmurs, and the better servants know when to let it pass unopened, like weather under a door. Discretion is the strong currency of the place. A glance can be a command. A lack of glance can be a reprieve. At a crossroads of passages hangs a simple plan, pricked with tiny holes where pins once marked repairs. Few palaces survive with complete backstage maps. Renovations blur lines, fires erase evidence, and later emperors altered what earlier ones prized. Even so, among the surviving plans and ledgers, a pattern emerges. Parallel worlds laid cheek by jowl. Public flow in straight, emphatic lines. Private flow in diagonals and loops that give a sovereign choices. How to reach a library without crossing an anteroom of waiting faces. How to pass from a desk to a gallery with only the soft scrape of a key. Smell broadens the picture. Linen dried on racks above a hot flue leaves a sun-clean ghost in the air. In the bakery court, even in winter, a sweetness rises when buckwheat pancakes are griddled for a fasting day. The buckwheat earthy, the butter nutty, the steam perfumed faintly with the resin of the wood that heated the iron. A scullion, carrying a crate of apples carefully, breathes on his fingers and dreams, perhaps, of eating one without asking. In a tiny still room, an under-housekeeper decants spirit of lavender into dark glass for airing rooms in damp weather. Between the service world and the sovereign's world lies a door that looks like wall. A narrow latch, smoothed by years, opens onto a cabinet with two desks facing each other. This is a hinge space, translating corridors into command. Here, a secretary reads out summaries. Here, decisions queue like sledges on the quay. When Catherine wishes to avoid the parade of the great staircase, she takes these turns and arrives at her papers poised rather than breathless, warmed rather than chilled. The corridor ends, as so many do in palaces, not in a flourish, but in a hush. Ahead, the light changes quality, colder, finer, filtered through thinner curtains. The sound changes too, fewer footfalls, more silence between ticks of the clock. A door that opens only from within stands waiting, its key turned on the far side. Beyond it lies the morning's desk, the news of provinces and philosophers, and the narrow line of pencil that will send warmth outward through the empire like heat through these walls. The latch moves, the door yields, and the hush beyond is shaped for thought. No gilt thunder here, just a cabinet of work. Paneling warm as tea, a window rimmed with ice ferns, two desks set crosswise like instruments tuned to different keys. On one sits a writing slope with a groove polished by the travel of a right hand. On the other, a neat siegework of baskets and files. Today, answers, archives, labeled in a firm, legible hand. The day's first tray has already arrived along the service route we traced. Wax seals glow. Ribbons show provincial colors fading with age. The packets are arranged under a leather weight, a bronze hand that holds the morning down. A secretary, boots dried and brushed, stands at an angle of attention that allows his breath to warm one hand over the stove grill without being seen. He clears his throat, softly. From the governor of Smolensk, the road posts repaired, timber quotas met for winter stoves, a petition from a widow seeking remission of arrears. Another. From the Collegium of Foreign Affairs. Amsterdam reports credit is tight. London prints a new pamphlet on the balance of Europe. And he does not read everything. These rooms were built to spare a sovereign the wasteful page. Catherine prefers margins to speeches. Pencil in hand, black, not red, so as not to shout. She underlines verbs, queries numbers, writes in French where the thought has come to her in that language, in Russian where the subject demands a firm native cadence, in German where an echo of childhood makes a particular sentence sit straighter. Quotas, verify. If widow, allow 2 quarters. Ask Panine, does London exaggerate? She marks one sheet with a small diagonal slash, an agreed signal to draft a reply in her voice, not the Chancellery's, because she will not have that case lost in the stacking of papers. The world comes at her in sheets, reports from the Senate and the colleges, petitions from towns that line rivers like beads on string, inventories from arsenals, contracts for salted fish and sailcloth, a note from the Saint, Petersburg foundling home with its careful accounts of tiny lives. There are foreign gazettes too, Gazette de Leyde folded to show a column on French salons, the Hamburger Relations with a rumor that smells of port wine, the St. Petersburg Vedomosti with notices of a concert, a lecture, a fire contained by watchmen near the Litany yard. News is a weather system. She reads its isobars. Amid the state paper lies correspondence that is not state but shapes it nonetheless. A letter from Paris, clever and stinging, signed by a wit whose books have already found their way north. Another from a philosopher whose pages, though heavy, turn faster when he visits in person and argues with his hands. She will answer both. Voltaire she has never met, yet his sentences sweep from Fernie like a broom that keeps cobwebs off the ceiling of thought. Diderot she will one day sit with in these very rooms, exasperated by his heat and delighted by his candor. She takes notes to herself on a spare leaf. On toleration, quote him to himself. On censorship, freedom in principle, prudence in practice. At the edge of the desk lies a thin volume bound in brown calf, edges sprinkled red, a copy of the instruction, the nakaz, that she had issued to guide the Legislative Commission. The book is a little worn at the corners. She thumbs a page where Montesquieu nods toward climates and laws. She adds a tick in the margin, as if to mark that an idea is a guest who requires supervision. Outside the window, the Neva gives a round crack that runs like a whip under the ice, and a sentry on the quay leans into his cloak. The secretary reads on, careful to mix large with small so the rhythm does not grow monotonous. A complaint from merchants in Archangel, tariffs on hemp bite early this season. A request from a schoolmistress for a stipend to teach 6 girls their letters. A report from the police on a brawl at a riverside tavern. 2 injured, both fined. Catherine pauses over the schoolmistress and writes, "Give. 6 becomes 60 if 1 begins." She knows that such notes have a way of multiplying into statutes. A state is not built in marble only. It is mortared with decisions that smell faintly of ink and tallow. In one basket, darker string binds a packet marked personal, confidential. The secretary does not touch it. When she lifts the seal, the powder of it clings to her thumb. The hand is a diplomat's, his consonants stiff even on the page. He hints at shifts in Prussian posture, at courtesies that may hide pressure, at a dinner remark in Vienna that tasted of iron under the sauce. She reads without blinking, folds the letter along its original crease, and tucks it under the writing slope where private replies are composed in a smaller, tighter script. Papers also speak of the rooms we will walk later. An invoice lists porcelain from Saxony, cups thin as eggshell, glazes like sky after rain, destined for a small cabinet where light doubles along glass. A bill for a globe with the latest corrections in the north. Its cartouche busy with dolphins that refuse to be banished by better latitudes. A memorandum proposes a new arrangement of maps, a wall that will show the empire not as a continuous green, but as a network of rivers and roads that can be repaired and taxed. She writes beside it, "Have the map room opened after dinner." The morning grows warm with purpose. Sand shakes from a small glass onto wet ink. The grains flash, dull, then slide into a tray where they will be dried and used again. A dispatch rider thaws by the stove and tries not to look at the Empress's shoes. A clerk, dismissed, backs 1 step, then another, and vanishes along the corridor like a letter slipping into the slot of a desk. Not every paper comforts. A governor writes of poor harvest in a district already gnawed too close by last year's frost. A factory owner petitions for permission to import a master workman from abroad. A priest reports seditious talk among boatmen who have had more spirits than bread. The pencil hesitates over these, then moves again. Famine relief, improve roads before spring. Permit the workmen, bind apprentices to him by contract. Watch the boatmen, find their grievance before their leader. The clock on the mantel ticks toward the hour when the public day will assert itself. Audiences, a lesson with a young Grand Duke, a measured drift through the green drawing room, where courtiers rise like a field before the wind. She pushes back, stands, and the little spaniel, who has been pretending to sleep, blinks and follows her shadow. She will not go out by the grand door. She turns instead toward a side passage that breathes a different air, cooler, lime-washed, faintly scented with the spirit of lavender. There, a narrower world waits, a cabinet tiled for tea, a shelf of plates that ring like glass when touched, a lift whose ropes are newly tarred. The secretary hesitates. Your Majesty, shall I bring the maps here? She smiles with that small economy that tells him he has chosen well. After the porcelain, she says, so that the eye is awake before the mind measures. The door to the next room is not grand. It wears its paint without fuss, and its latch has been smoothed by 100 quiet mornings. On the other side lies color arranged against winter, and a table whose white surface holds a blue that seems to travel. Open the modest door, and winter changes color. White wakes into blues, greens, and the tender pinks that porcelain kilns coax from fire. This is not a throne room. It is a cabinet arranged like a thought. Shelves march in orderly ranks along the walls, their edges lined with velvet to keep glaze from chipping. In the morning light, cups and ewers glow as if lit from within. Porcelain holds winter's daylight differently than canvas, cooler, calmer, a kind of stored frost that does not bite. A steward has prepared the table with its white cloth and a neat pyramid of letters to be answered after the eye has had its share. He stands back while Catherine moves among the pieces. Meissen from Saxony, hard paced, strong in profile, a whiteness like packed snow. Sèvres, soft paste and tender blues, with gilding that seems to float just above the surface. Chinese wares with cobalt under the glaze, the blue shifting from storm to willow shade. She rests a finger under a handle to judge the weight and balance. She reads lips on a spout for the precision of the pour. Collecting for her is not hoarding, it is education of the hand. Inventories will later fix some of these objects in ink. Numbers, descriptions, prices, the names of donors anxious to be remembered. But the arrangement you see this morning is a living grammar. Cups speak to their saucers. A pair of vases holds a conversation across the room. A plate with a painted harbor answers a Dutch canvas on the next wall. When color repeats, the same lapis ground on porcelain and in a silk ribbon, it creates a sentence the eye can read without a single word. In the corners, where drafts gather, small stoves tick gently. Heat must be managed. Too much and glaze crazes, too little and hands shake. Lamps are hooded so light falls soft across curved surfaces, picking out the raised dots of jeweling, the thin gold that runs like a quiet line of music along a lip. The steward knows to keep vinegar away, its breath can dull guilt, and to set a small bowl of water behind the stove to hold back winter's dry bite. Catherine prefers to stand when she looks. Sitting in front of porcelain turns it into a picture. Standing makes it immediate, a world at the height of the hand. She asks for a cup to be brought to the table. A valet, sleeves neat, lifts it with 2 fingers and a thumb, the way a copyist lifts a single leaf from a stack. The tea is a little smoky this morning, the fragrance traveling ahead of the heat. Buckwheat cakes steam under a cloth, their edges brown and laced. A page notes which plate she chooses for the first bite. Such details seem small until one sees how often preference turns into policy. The taste for clarity in glaze becomes a taste for clarity in reports. Across the threshold, a second cabinet waits. Plainer, cooler, a room that speaks in lines. The map room does not dazzle, it steadies. Here hang sheets that make distant ground obey the desk. River courses drawn like thoughts. Boundary lines that can move with an argument and a seal. Towns that become dots and yet keep their real weather in the minds of those who read them. A large globe turns on a mahogany stand that smells faintly of sun-warmed wood even in winter. It is newly corrected in the north, where older cartouches still play sea monsters among latitudes now better known. The cartouches on the wall maps are little theaters. In one, putti hold navigational instruments. In another, allegory leans too heavy on a cornucopia. Catherine's finger follows not ornament, but rivers. She prefers the honest grammar of water, the Volga, the Dnieper, the Don, because water dictates trade and famine alike. A secretary stands ready with a yard of thin rule and a pencil. What distance from Smolensk to Riga if the post stations are properly supplied? A pause, a calculation. She nods once and writes in the margin of a memorandum, post relays, inspect, send rider unannounced. Maps in this room change with the century. Where older sheets swell with untroubled heraldry, newer ones carry the bite of measurement, triangulations, surveyed lines, printed scales that respect the stubbornness of rivers and the raggedness of frontiers. The Academy of Sciences has sent a packet, observations from a wintering party, corrections to a coastline, the latitude of a church spire taken at noon. She touches the paper and smiles at the steadiness of the hand that wrote figures, with breath fogging an air that froze ink in the pen between numbers. On a table lies an atlas with pages the color of cream and that faint smell of paste and linen thread. She turns a leaf. The hinge of it sounds like a tiny sail filling. Here is the Baltic constellated with ports. Here the Black Sea in a pale wash of blue. Here the long, long promises of Siberia, drawn in thin lines that could be sentences or roads depending on who reads them. A memorandum slips from between pages. A proposal to resettle along a river bend. Another for a new census counting not only households, but trades. She writes, trial, 2 districts, report honestly. The margin accepts the order as quietly as porcelain accepts light. What maps cannot show still presses in. News from beyond the empire moves as rumor first, then as correspondence, then, sometimes, as a map. A foreign envoy hints at adjustments to borders that have not yet found their lines. A note from a general draws a neat square around a town that is not paper. History will later give these moves names. In the cabinet, they are still pencil marks waiting for ink, and ink waiting for the crossing of a threshold in some distant council chamber. She does not feign certainty. Where the world is fogged, she writes, simply, inquire. The steward announces the porcelain restorer. He comes softly, hat in hand, a small leather roll under his arm. From it, he draws slips of tin for supporting a handle while glue sets, a brush for picking a crumb of dust from a repair before it marries the glaze forever, a bone folder polished like old soap. He shows a repaired saucer, its fracture invisible except in certain slants of light. She lifts it to the window, tests the line with the pad of a finger, and nods. The nod carries through the corridors later, as a rumor that warms the workshop better than the stove. Midday draws near. A page arrives with the Gazette de l'Aide folded to a column where philosophers argue in Paris. An officer requests, via the secretary, the loan of a map to brief a visiting envoy. A librarian sends word that a set of engravings has been unpacked in an adjoining gallery. The rooms breathe in and out. Porcelain, then maps, then paper, then the world again through a window where the sky brightens as if someone had turned the wick on day. Before she leaves, Catherine pauses between the cabinets. Porcelain to teach the eye, maps to organize the reach of the hand. Together they make a sovereign's instrument, intake and outgo, beauty and measure, a pairing that keeps policy from becoming either arid or merely ornamental. She touches the globe with 2 fingers and sets it moving with a motion that is almost nothing, almost a refusal of display. Beyond the door, a corridor runs toward a quieter annex raised along the river, a bridge between collection and life. Its name promises solitude and work in equal measure, and in it the rooms become even smaller, the thresholds more discreet, the contrivances more exact. The steward glances at the clock. The morning's audience will wait. The Empress turns toward the place that will soon give a new word to Europe. Cross the inner bridge where the palace meets the river, and the temperature of the day lowers to a working calm. Here, along the Neva, Catherine built not a mirror of ceremony, but a counterweight to it. Rooms that would later give their name to a museum, and, at first, belonged to a single person's hours. The word chosen matters. Hermitage, a hermit's refuge. In a city of parades and proclamations, this annex declared the right to think in private. The first building rose quickly after a decision made on paper. In 1764, a Berlin merchant, pressed by war's mathematics, offered a cache of paintings. Hundreds at once, a small nation of eyes and hands gathered in crates that smelled of hemp and sea. Catherine bought them, and with the purchase began a logic that architecture soon made stone. Paintings require walls. Walls require light. Light requires rooms proportioned not for dancing but for looking. Architects Jean-Baptiste Valin de la Motte and Yuri Felton drew a small pavilion beside the great palace, threading galleries like beads above the service courts and binding them with passages that joined thought to power without crossing a ballroom. Step through the discreet door and the air changes. The floors run in parquet that reads as quiet geometry underfoot. The walls are hung in greens and blues that rest the eye. Moldings are refined rather than loud. Windows face the river in calculated rhythm, giving a kind of northern clarity to canvases that once basked under softer skies. Attendants move with library manners. Here a frame is dusted with a feather. There a blind is angled to keep the light from eating a pigment whose recipe has more poetry than durability. The first hours in these rooms were neither public nor fixed by schedule. Catherine came when she chose, early, often, and with a mind uncluttered by the choreography of court. The crates from Berlin were opened with care, nails lifted, straw sorted, the hiss of paper as it let go from a varnished surface that had not seen day in months. A Rembrandt drew the room to a human center of gravity. A Rubens pressed warmth into a winter corner. Dutch harbors gave the Neva a cousin sea, domestic and industrious. She walked among them with a sovereign's economy of gesture, but the gaze was not ceremonial, it worked. Agents in Paris and Amsterdam wrote letters thick with adjectives. Philosophers, who in other corridors coached governments in prose, here turned dealers of taste. Denis Diderot would one day advise with the same candor that made him difficult at supper, and his friend Friedrich Melchior Grimm described the Paris salons for her as if writing weather reports for the eye. Catherine read, weighed, and decided. Collections already famous in Europe, assembled by families whose fortunes were ebbing, drifted toward the Neva on tides of diplomacy and debt. In the early 1770s, she secured paintings long praised in French rooms. Before that decade ended, the great group from Houghton in England, once the pride of Walpole's halls, would find new light here. Dates and bills record the transactions. The rooms record their consequences. This was not hoarding. A pattern emerges if you stand with her and trace it. History by schools, Flemish weight and velvet, Italian air and anatomy, Dutch attention to the honest business of bread, brass, and sky. She liked conversation among canvases, a painter speaking across a room to a rival or a follower. A wall might pair a luminous Italian with a northern master who refused idealization and loved the stubborn shape of an earthen jug. The pair tells more truth together than either alone. Behind her, a secretary noted placements and pencil marks that would become an inventory, and, later, a catalog, first for memory's sake, then for governance, and eventually for the public record. Galleries multiply. The small Hermitage begets the great. Bridges across courtyards turn weather into architecture. A glazed passage becomes a winter river of light. The Neva slides past, indifferent and exacting, while inside carpenters whisper with their planes and gilders lay leaf that drinks the day like tea. A new theater is planned as a companion to the rooms of looking. For the theater, a different hand, Giacomo Quarenghi, with a classical grammar imported in his pocket, will raise a house where sound and sight take their turns, disciplined like infantry at drill, and yet capable of the sudden mercy of music on a dark afternoon. In these rooms, politics changes its clothing. Diplomacy can be done without a throne if the painting behind a chair argues more persuasively than a speech. A minister from abroad stands before a Van Dyck and sees not only satin and knee, but a posture of rule. A scholar from the academy points to a landscape where the weather is an ethic. A young Grand Duke learns to prefer proportion over glitter, and, by degrees, carries that preference into edicts about streets and schools. Collections act like slow legislation. The Hermitage refines the day's pulse. After the morning papers, Catherine crosses by the warmed passage, her shoes whispering on wood. A valet opens the door to a high, cool gallery. The dog settles in the rectangle of sun that has managed to find the floor. She pauses before a canvas where a woman's face is not ideal but particular, the intelligence in the mouth, the fatigue in the orbit of the eye, and the sovereign registers again that a state is made of specific lives, not allegories. She moves on, lighter, tension never vanishes. Ownership is a public sentence in a capital where rumor travels on sled runners. Some murmured that the Empress spent on pictures what should be spent on roads. Others argued the opposite, that collections civilize a court and steady taste, which in turn steadies law. She read both views and answered in the only currency that mattered to her here: consistency. Purchases continued. Restorers were retained. The rooms were kept warm enough to preserve varnish and cool enough to preserve judgment. The Hermitage also becomes laboratory. Conservators test glues and varnishes in a northern climate. Frames are mended with local timber fitted to Italian habits. A small studio copies a head or a hand to train the eye, not to deceive it. A porter, who has learned the feel of paintings by weight rather than sight, can tell within a hand's width where a canvas will want to tilt when lifted. A clerk, indexing subjects, invents a taxonomy that lets a human find quickly what a human wants: Madonna, market, martyrdom, moonlight. Outside, the river creaks and flags stiffen. Inside, a new kind of privacy is perfected. Not secrecy, but concentration. To make that concentration practical, devices hide in the walls and floors: shafts, pulleys, speaking tubes, and, in a snug suite beyond the last gallery, a contrivance that will translate appetite into ritual without summoning a single footman into the room. An artisan has been testing weights and counterweights all week. A carpenter has cut a flawless circle through a tabletop and sanded the edge until it feels like the lip of a porcelain cup. Evening will ask for company: 2, 4, perhaps 6 chosen minds, and the chosen minds will eat as if attended by ghosts. No door will open, no plate will be seen to cross a threshold, and yet courses will appear, rise, and depart as if the room itself had hands. For that, we must descend a floor and watch the mechanism breathe, go down one flight, into the under-rhythm of the rooms above, and you hear it: a soft shiver of rope, the padded kiss of wood on wood, the small metallic churr of a pulley as it settles. This is the Hermitage's second language, mechanics speaking politeness. The idea is simple enough to sketch and subtle enough to change a dinner: a system of shafts and counterweights that lets courses appear in a private dining room without a single servant breaking the conversation or the silence. The corridor below smells of clean oak and lamp oil. Along one wall run 3 frame shafts, boxed in and painted, each fitted with a platform the size of a small table. When cranked below, the platform glides upward through a matched opening in the floor above. In the dining room, what the eye sees is elegance: a round table with a perfect disc at its center, panels that read as wainscoting, a hearth whose fire is modest and well-behaved. What the room does is more interesting than what it seems. Catherine liked to choose her table companions with precision. 4 was good for thought, 6 could be lively if temperaments were balanced, 8 was already a miniature court. In the snug Hermitage suite, the count was often small. A bell is not rung, instead a cord is drawn, gentle, and a footman in the service level takes the cue. He checks the list chalked in a neat hand: soup, pike with dill, roast capon, buckwheat with mushrooms, then sweets, fruits and syrup, tea. Each course sits already arranged on a platform in the warm pantry, covered with a linen cloth, to keep heat and gossip in their proper places. A carpenter, he is more machinist than joiner, stands ready by the crank. He wears gloves to keep sweat from the rope. With a steady rhythm, pull, ease, pull, he guides the table upward, his mate watching the top of the shaft, where a felt collar hushes the last breath of travel. Above, in the dining room, the center of the round table opens like a theater's trap, and the course arrives with the dignity of a thought, not shouted, not clattered, simply present. Covers are lifted by the diners themselves. Plates are passed hand to hand with the informal gravity that intimacy permits. Devices like this were not Catherine's invention. They had cousins in French retreats where monarchs dined sans valets, tables volantes, flying tables, dinners à la trappe in deliberate silence. But here, in this northern annex where privacy had the value of a jewel, the mechanism fit a philosophy. Conversation could unspool without the constant editing that a listening staff demanded. A joke did not need to be coded for 20 ears. A doubt could be phrased exactly. A guest could be contradicted without a rumor splitting into 30 versions by morning. The machine made discretion an architecture. Below, the choreography is as exact as any court ceremony, only quieter. The soup is portioned into lidded tureens that nest into rings of felt, so they will not creep when the platform breathes. Plates warm on a brick ledge by the stove. Bread rests under a folded cloth whose edge has been marked with a stitch so that the same side always faces outward. The crank turns, the rope pays out. A pulley murmurs a note that only those who live with it hear. The platform docks, still, and a latch holds its weight with a satisfied click. The men who tend the gears belong to the invisible guild that keeps palaces feasible, artisans who know how to make silence do work. One has learned the trick of sanding the smallest radius into the edge of the opening so cloth will not snag as dishes pass. Another can smell when the hemp rope needs tallow long before it frays. They sign their repairs in pencil where only their successors will see. A date, an initial, the faint pride of keeping an empress's dinner steady. Upstairs, light is set to flatter thought rather than jewels. Shades on the candles give an even wash. The fire is kept low so talk can be heard at the edges of sentences. A guest speaks of a new book printed in Paris, its claims impudent, its structure ingenious. Another argues that maps should show not only roads and rivers, but the tolls that slow them, so that policy can be drawn in the truth of delay. Catherine listens, the corner of her mouth moving when a phrase pleases her. The mechanism allows a generosity of pause. Where a servant's entrance would have bent a sentence toward performance, the rising table leaves it honest. The menu itself is a negotiation between place and reach. Pike from the Neva is firm, its bones parsed with surgeon's care. Dill is the northern courage that makes winter fish taste of summer memory. Mushrooms were dried in autumn and now return to life in butter. Buckwheat carries the stove's resin in each grain. The capon has a French confidence about it. The sauce understands mustard. A small glass of something fierce warms the talk for a moment. Then tea steadies it, the steam smelling faintly of hay. Not all dinners were unobserved by history. Some evenings produced decisions large enough to echo in documents. Others produced only the quiet knitting of understanding that makes later edicts less brittle. The table that rose through the floor did not magic away the politics of appetite, but it helped discipline the performance of rank. Here, wit counted more than epaulets. Curiosity rose in the room, like heat kept properly by a good stove. Below, the last course is arranged with almost maternal attention. Preserved cherries set in a ring of pale cream, candied peel that has kept the ghost of summer in its sugar, a plate of nuts tapped from shells with a small crack that sounds like distant frost. A boy, he is not yet old enough for livery, tests the weight of the platform with both palms and looks upward as if he could see through oak to the light above. Steady, the machinist says. His hands know the exact turning that makes the dessert appear as if time, not rope, had delivered it. There were criticisms, of course. To some, the contrivance seemed an indulgence, a toy. Others muttered that eating without servants smacked of secrecy, but the devices answered to a practical ethic. Privacy is a tool of concentration. The same logic that kept paintings in a quiet key kept plates moving on hidden ropes. The sovereign's day had 1,000 eyes upon it. This room gave her a few hours when thought could be naked without being alone. When the company stands, the center disc lowers again, soft as a yawn. Dishes vanish. The platform slides past the felt collar and is received by hands that do not drop even a cherry stone. Ash is cleared, bones are counted and noted for the kitchen economy, linen is checked for the smallest stain, and set to soak in a tub whose water will steam the corridor windows for a moment like breath. Catherine will not return to the great staircase. There is another route from here, a narrower stair tucked into the thickness of the wall, meant for feet that know where they are going. It turns once, twice, and the light changes from honey to river gray. On its landing, a door looks like paneling until one sees the brass rubbed brighter where fingers have learned it. Beyond that door, the palace grows private again. Night stairs, hidden doors, and a geometry that lets power move a finger's width from the world without losing feel for it. Night in a northern palace does not fall. It settles, layer by layer, like felt. The grand staircase empties, wax puddles into cups. The echo of protocol dies to a breath. Then another architecture declares itself. Stairs too narrow for ceremony. Doors that look like wall. Passages that run inside the thickness of masonry, like thoughts inside a skull. They are not romantic inventions. They are the carpentry of prudence. A sovereign cannot rule if she is always watched, nor sleep if she is never guarded. These routes solve both problems at once. Take the night stair. It winds with the shyness of a cat, hugging a wall so thick the winter has trouble finding the seam. The treads are shallow and slightly worn, the wear concentrated at the edges, where careful feet like Catherine's save steps by habit. A handrail of polished oak registers a century of touch, cool at first, then warm where skin has taught it the shape of the living. On one landing, a slit of a window gives the Neva back as a strip of iron light. Somewhere downriver, a flow turns, scrapes, and carries moonlight like a plate. The stair is tiled at its base for cleanliness. Lime wash holds off the must of winter. Hooks wait for cloaks. A peg bears a brass lantern crowned in green glass so the flame will not bite the eyes that have been reading all day. A watchman sits on a low stool by a door that hides in plain sight. His halberd is propped with its blade hooded to keep it from ringing against stone. He knows the particular knocking that means not alarm but speed, and the other that means not summons but quiet tea. Along these routes, sound is the currency of caution. Hinges are dressed with soap so they breathe rather than squeal. Latches meet their strikes with felt between. Floorboards are laid across rather than along, so their joints do not line up and sing under weight. A carpenter comes at dawn once a fortnight with a small file wrapped in cloth, a ritual maintenance that smells of oak dust and tallow. He writes nothing down. All the measurements live in his fingers. The hidden doors are less mysteries than manners. Paneling in the corridor is divided into clean rectangles of wood and silk. In one rectangle, a seam is thinner, a grain misaligned by just a hair. Press, and it yields to a neat geometry of concealed iron. The room beyond is not a dungeon. It is a hinge space, a reading closet, a writing niche, a dressing room for moments when the public day must be shed like a coat before the private hour can begin. In winter, a small tiled stove keeps such closets temperate, just enough that combs do not bite the fingers and ink does not thicken on the nib. Security in the 18th century palace is both visible and invisible. Guards present their profiles where the public can admire them. Elsewhere, in these back passages, protection is built into the plan. Doors never open directly from public to bedchamber. There is always an anteroom that swallows noise and rank. Fire, the old enemy of wooden cities, is prepared for without fuss. Leather buckets hang in pairs. Sand stands in barrels by stove mouths. An iron plate lets a watchman test a coal's temper without laying it on the floor. Records from neighboring palaces make plain how much thought the century devoted to not burning down. The Winter Palace learned from those lessons and tied them into caution like knots. Catherine used the night stairs as often for economy as for secrecy. To pass from her papers to a draftsman's desk without crossing the green drawing room was efficient. To reach a small chapel for a moment of silence without collecting a parade behind her was piety guarded from performance. To carry a thought from canvas to edict before it grew cold required no witnesses and only the companionship of floor, rail, and a dog whose nails ticked softly on wood. Rumor keeps other stories alive, ducts for whispers, spy peepholes hidden in allegorical frames, doors that opened into the private chambers of favorites. The closer one reads plans and bills, the simpler the truth becomes. There were service grills so a valet could hear a bell above the conversation. There were wall-thick passages that let a senior aide appear with a paper at a nod rather than a summoned flourish. There were, too, passages that shortened the distance between a sovereign and those she trusted most. But the geometry honors physics, not scandal. The doors work because the joints are well made, not because romance needs them to betray anyone. Smell maps the hidden palace when sight fails. Linen dried above, a flue leaves a clean, sun-remembering scent that finds you before you find the laundry passage. Beeswax, warmed by hands more than by flame, breathe sweetly from panel seams. Where the stair slips past the pantry's flank, rye and dill make a promise that winter cannot forbid. At the elbow of one passage, a draft carries a trout of river cold. Someone has left the outer door open in the yard, and the night wash of the Neva snakes into the house as if to inspect it. The small hours redraw ranks. A chamberlain whose voice carries at noon speaks in thread at midnight. A maid who at dinner moved as silence now has authority, because she knows which shelf holds spirits of lavender for a sleepless night, and which cushion eases a sovereign's back when the day's writing has borrowed too much from the spine. A boy, less boy than shadow, tends a brazier meant to take the damp from shoes. His reward is the warmth his hands drink, and the news that moves past him like a river he will one day learn to ford. These routes also prepare tomorrow. In a closet no bigger than a stable's stall, garments rest with the stillness of animals dozing. A mantua's page is pinned with notes, hem length altered to avoid the draft at the east door, sleeve freed for writing, a ribbon replaced with one that bargains less with light. A seamstress has left her needle in a tuft of beeswax, a minor constellation next to chalk marks that look like a stargazer's map. Textiles in a winter capital have politics. Color warms status. Fabric chooses alliances. French silk that gleams like river ice at noon. Russian wool that stands its ground against the weather. velvet that absorbs candlelight and returns it as gravity. Light itself is rationed and engineered at night. Shades on lamps are turned to keep glare from windows where a watcher outside might see too much. A wedge of tin sits under a candlestick to train the drip. Mirrors are pivoted slightly, so they lend glow without inviting the fire to travel. A footman rubs ash from a glass chimney with vinegar and a torn corner of yesterday's Gazette, and the flame rewards the room with a round, intelligent steadiness. Sometimes the stair is used for a single step only, up from a thought to a window to test the night with eyes. The river is a slow lung, the sky a slate full of erased sentences. Across the water, a watchman strikes metal with metal, a small, honest declaration that he is awake. Catherine listens, and the sound approves of the palace's private geometry. Vigilance in public, concentration in private, a seam between them that only a hand that belongs has learned. Near the top of the night stair, the disguised door that returns to the daytime suites wears its secrecy lightly. The brass where fingers seek it has been polished by need, not vanity. Beyond it, quiet spreads into a room that will, by daylight, read as comfort. Fabrics speaking with light, colors choosing their alliances, surfaces deciding what to say and what to keep back. The latch lifts, the seam of the panel draws a breath. On the other side, winter will turn into cloth and glow. Step through the panel, and winter turns fluent. The room does not greet you with trumpets. It answers the night stare in a lower key, textiles tuned to the latitude, light trained like a well-schooled voice. Here, Catherine governed atmosphere the way she governed paper, with a preference for clarity, proportion, and things that worked. Fabrics make the first argument. The walls are dressed, not merely painted. Damask or silk stretched on battens so the surface has the soft give of breath. Pattern is chosen for conversation, not domination. A large pomegranate too loud for short northern days is set aside. A smaller repeat, leaf and tendril, keeps the eye occupied without pulling it off the sentence. Along the floor, a border of wool carpet dampens the hard syllables of step and chair. Curtains are double, an inner gauze to temper glare on pale mornings, an outer fall of heavier stuff for dusk, and for drafts that slip through even the best joinery when the Neva thinks like iron. Color is policy. Greens red warm against winter light and nod to the palace's public livery. Pale blues pull day deeper into the room when the sun refuses to rise above a pewter line. Creams and fawns flatter faces at close range, so conversation keeps its human grain. Velvet drinks candlelight and returns it as gravity. Satin bounces it and makes a room too quick. Catherine tends toward the former, in rooms that ask for thought, the latter only where ceremony insists. A narrow placket of braid along a curtain's edge is not vanity. It reins in fray and gives fingers something honest to find in the dark. The logic continues at the windows. The glass is clear and slightly wavy, the kind that remembers the hand that spun it. In winter, the interior side gains a second skin. Slim frames holding oiled paper or an extra pane, set in for the season to still the draft. Pelmets above, their undersides papered so dust will not fall like dandruff on silk, hide cords and improve the draft. On deep sills, pots of laurel or myrtle keep a polite green that refuses despair when snow has been saying the same thing for weeks. Light is engineered rather than scattered. Candles of beeswax, kept for rooms that matter, burn cleaner and warmer than tallow. Their scent is honey and resin with a note of church. Shades of thin parchment, green or cream, train the beam down to hands and pages. Mirrors are placed to multiply, glow without encouraging the fire to walk. Over mantel, yes. Facing a doorway, no. In the corners stand girandoles like polite antlers, each branch holding a cup that catches drips before they bite the gilt. Late in Catherine's reign, a new invention begins to appear on certain tables, the argand lamp, with its steady windproof flame made generous by a ring of air. It is admitted cautiously, like a clever foreigner, useful, soon indispensable, but watched. Light has manners in this room. It does not dazzle, it proposes. A secretary, reading at the edge of the pool of brightness, keeps his voice low so the air itself will not vibrate away from the page. A needlewoman, bringing in a sleeve that has been altered to free the arm for writing, turns the work to show the seam not to the person but to the lamp. Even the dog learns where the warm rectangle will appear each afternoon and arranges sleep accordingly, like an old man with a favorite bench. Fabrics and light also perform a quieter labor, defending the body from the city. St. Petersburg is a clever, difficult climate. equal parts brine and wind. Portieres over interior doors stop drafts that can thieve a careful thought. A rolled rug at a threshold keeps the river from insinuating itself into the spine. A screen near a tile stove keeps cheeks from turning cardinal while backs freeze. The stove itself is a grammar lesson in heat. Ceramic tiles with small scenes, skaters, windmills, pastoral plenty, throw warmth in long paragraphs rather than in the short shouts a fireplace makes. A pan of water on the top keeps the air kind to paper and lungs. Taste here has a job beyond pleasure. Catherine encouraged Russian manufactories even as she bought from Lyon and Berlin, and farther still. A bolt of silk from Moscow sits beside a length from France. A shawl woven after a Persian pattern lives a useful life as draft breaker on the back of a writing chair. Things are chosen for what they do to the room's temperature of mind. A table with a leather top that takes pencil without sulking. A chair with a slightly lower front rail because the person who uses it writes more than she leans. A standing screen with feet wide enough not to tangle a dress hem when a thought must be carried at speed from desk to door. On the mantel stands a timepiece whose face is simple and whose case is more honest than pretty. The tick is a margin, time reduced to punctuation. A tiny bell counts quarters, not to rule the room, but to prevent the day from slipping out of its sleeve. Beside it, a small porcelain vase holds winter's best compromise, branches cut from a conservatory. Citrus leaves glossy as enamel, a single flower like a promise the calendar has no right to make. It smells faintly when you are very near, and not at all when you are working, which is exactly as it should be. Clothing joins the collaboration. Catherine could wear diamonds like arguments when the stage demanded it. Here she prefers the fluency of a gown that respects paper, sleeves that clear the wrist, a fichu that warms the chest without trailing into ink, a fabric with enough body to keep dignity while letting the arm move. Portraits will later propose ideals. Rooms like this tell the truth of a working sovereign. A well-made bodice, steady shoes, and a shawl that can become a thought when folded and placed on the back of the chair you intend to return to. There is a politics to comfort. Rooms that cradle attention make better laws than rooms that scatter it. The proof lies in the rhythm that develops without being ordered. A page at the door with a tray, a map weighted with a small stone so that it does not curl back on its own certainty. A low stool for the spaniel that doubles as a step when a book on a high shelf refuses to come down to rank. Even the palette of the bindings means something. Calf, sprinkled red at the edges so a volume can be found quickly on a dim afternoon when a sentence from Montesquieu or Grotius must be fetched to argue with a minister. Outside, the river gives one soft groan as if turning in sleep. Inside, candlelight raises small suns in the gilt and is swallowed politely by the velvet. The room has done its work. It has kept the cold from the hands that write. It has kept noise off the surface of listening. It has made thought a temperature one can hold. On the small table near the second window, under a green shade, lies a packet sealed in black wax and addressed in a hand from far to the west. A wit with a wasp in his pen, perhaps. Or a philosopher whose letters sometimes steam in the winter air like mulled wine. The seal waits for the knife. The black seal takes the knife like ice taking a skate. Clean, with a small, satisfied sigh. Wax falls in two neat scallops beside the blotter. Paper loosens as if the room itself had exhaled. The hand is instantly recognizable. Slopes of consonants like a field in wind, vowels pricked to a fine point. Catherine anchors the sheet with 2 fingers and reads, not with a court voice but with the small murmur one saves for weather, poetry, and news that might rearrange a day. Letters from Europe enter these rooms as a second climate. They carry other latitudes' smells. Ink that remembers Paris damp, a trace of smoke from a stove in Ferney, a sweetness of gum arabic that clings to the tongue if you forget and wet the thread when you seal the reply. The great correspondent at Ferney has sent brightness and barbs in equal portions. He praises a decree with a compliment sharp enough to keep it honest. He skewers a superstition and begs her to quench it with law. There is always a little theater in his sentences, but the footlights never drown the sense. She laughs once, quiet, a single shoulder, then underlines a phrase that will serve as speech without needing to credit the sage who minted it. Beside it lies another packet, hand broader, the ink bitten into the paper by a nib that insisted. It is Diderot's, forwarded by a friend with a note that asks her patience. Il écrit comme il respire, he writes as he breathes, which is to say, abundantly. Tonight she will answer briefly, because brevity is the kindest reply to a man who cannot afford it. She will not tell him yet that she means to invite him north. She prefers invitations to be weather, not forecast. Open the next. Grimm's Correspondance Littéraire, that private river of Paris talk, sent to chosen readers far from the Seine. The pages are neat where Diderots tumble, amused where others declaim. Here is a painter praised not for satin, but for skin that remembers blood. Here a new book that bites. Here a rumor that philosophy has left the armchair and begun to pace. She reads with the pencil in her hand. Order a copy. Ask Falconet what he thinks. If bored, keep anyway. One bores a little to train the mind. A secretary sits near the pool of lamplight, taking down phrases she throws without looking. The discipline here is not ceremony, but exchange. She does not dictate, she speaks. He does not record, he listens and catches. When she wants a sentence that will cross languages still smiling, she stands and walks while she frames it, as if the hinge of the hip were connected to rhetoric. A draft begins in French, returns to Russian for the vowels that carry authority, and ends in a short German cadence that knots the string. She is not fooled by letters that flatter the sovereign while attempting to instruct the woman. Voltaire's wit glances. It does not rule here. Diderot's furnace heats. It does not temper steel. She keeps a small copy of her nakaz open like a yardstick. Laws should be made for all, the page reminds, and cannot be fashioned to a case. She has disapproved of torture with that clarity that reads like ice. She has praised toleration in terms that make priests draw breath and magistrates learn the patience of thinking twice. She writes to Fernie, "We will do what is possible. The rest we will starve by degrees." The pencil underlines degrees twice. Letters carry failures too, and she does not hide from them. A provincial official writes in a hand that leans as if tired. A school for girls failed because the teacher married and the town said learning had left with her. A printer is fined for a pamphlet that barks louder than it bites. A censor overreaches, slicing a good book for a single page. Catherine's reply is cool and precise. Teach another, bind her to a term. Fine the printer, lightly. Fines are lessons when they do not become ruin. Censors to be educated, not everything pricks is a wound. At the window the afternoon has turned to pewter. Far off, a flag tightens on its pole as if bracing for more dark. She moves a lamp closer, and the room contracts pleasantly to what the light can govern. A page lays a small porcelain tray within reach. Ink, sand, 2 wafers of sealing wax, a sliver of lemon to wake a tired pen. The smell is acid and clean. The spaniel shifts and sighs. The sigh lifts a corner of a letter and makes a small weather within the grater. Read softly, answer firmly. She writes to Voltaire with the smile that made generals wish to agree. You, sir, are a better playwright than legislator when you draw characters larger than life. I must count heads and shoelaces as well as souls. To Grimm, continue the secret newspaper of minds. My city drinks it as the stove drinks birch air. To a provincial noble who protests a school tax, if your daughters are to be wiser than your horses, you must stable money in the classroom, not only in the barn. Some letters require staging. A diplomatic note to a court that would prefer old etiquette to new law is copied thrice. Once for the archive, once for the envoy, once to be read aloud in the green drawing room, where titles listen for whether the word friendship arrives before or after the word interest. She rehearses the order under her breath, rearranging 2 adjectives until they stand shoulder to shoulder without jostling. A margin note keeps her honest. No promises I would not keep if the river rose. Not all replies are on paper. Sometimes she answers by purchase. Grimm praises a painter's head. Within a month, the head is on a cart north. Voltaire admires a decree. Within a season, she refines it and sends the revision to a governor who thought the first version a gentleman's parlor trick. Diderot argues that theaters teach a city to breathe together. She builds a theater and then insists it breathe at the same time nightly so the lungs of St. Petersburg learn punctuality. In a drawer close to the hand that writes, rests a packet in another hand entirely. Potemkins, bold, impatient, capable of tearing the corner of the page when he signs too quickly. He writes not only of armies and ships, but of bridges, parks, villages that learn how to become towns by the example of well-laid streets. He writes of her health when she does not. He writes of what can be done now and what can be made to seem as if it had already been done, which is sometimes the same art as governance. She does not open his letters yet. She waits for the room to shift from Europe's talk back to the palace's breath. The lamp hums softly. The stove gives one tick, then rests. Outside, a sleigh goes by with runners that sing on hard snow. Inside, she wipes the nib, dries the line with sand that shines for a heartbeat, and closes one reply with a seal that shows an eagle whose two heads agree without forcing the point. A footfall in the corridor has a grammar she knows. It is not the page's careful ledger step, nor the secretary's quill-conscious tread. It is heavier and looser, with a certain confidence in the floor, as if the man trusted Wood to remember him. The disguised door gives the breath it learned in Part 8. The latch permits itself to be known. A voice at the seam, pitched low to suit these rooms. "Your Majesty, shall I enter by the small door?" The latch yields and the seam becomes a door, not with flourish, but with the courtesy this wing demands. He enters without snow, having shed it 2 turns back where a valet minds a narrow mat and a brush. Grigory Potemkin, later Tavrichesky by right of Crimea, now already weight and weather in the room, bows as if to a thought he means to agree with before he argues. His step is unmistakable, confident but padded by felt soles, a compromise between parade and secrecy. The dog tests his hand and approves. The hand smells of leather and cold metal. Protocol here is not the ballroom's geometry. Rank has been remapped for use. No trumpets, no chamberlain pronouncing names syllable by syllable. Instead, a grammar of glances and distances. He does not kiss the hand in the old way. He allows the air to register respect and brings news before warmth has time to become theater. Catherine gestures toward the chair with the slightly lower front rail, the one made for someone who speaks more in paragraphs than in bows. He sits, not fully. He perches at the angle that says ready to stand if the matter becomes public. His papers carry the hard smells of places the Hermitage maps know by grace rather than cold. Hemp from rigging stores, tar, a ghost of river mud from shipyards on the southern rivers. He opens a leather folder. "From Kherson," he says, and the word carries a south that feels impossible in this winter air. Keel laid for another 64. Sawyers promise speed if iron arrives before thaw. He taps a line where an engineer has sketched a dock like a chess problem. His nail makes a small, dry sound on the paper. In another sheet, a list of settlers, their trades in a column: blacksmith, cooper, beekeeper, carpenter. A woman marked midwife with a deliberate clarity that is as much policy as compassion. History will later lean hard on the romance, as history likes to. It will draw them in colors they sometimes wore and sometimes did not, and it will embroider. In these rooms, the embroidery is cut back to seam. He is an instrument she trusts, impatient, shrewd, capable of thinking in roads and ships rather than in paragraphs only, and also a presence that rearranges the air. Their intimacy, which breathes on paper and sometimes in rumor like frost on glass, is managed here with the precision of weights and counterweights. Servants know that when the small door admits him, the path to the table mechanism must be kept clear. The candles trimmed so light falls on figures, not faces. He reports like a man who has learned to speak to maps. "The Dnieper runs free 3 weeks earlier last year," he says. "We must steal the spring." He sketches with his thumb on the leather where another canal ought to cut between rivers and lets the idea stand as if it had always been there in the terrain. "For the fleet, masts from Arkhangelsk will fail us if frost chews the pitch. I will have local larch tried, and we will bless or curse it by July." She nods, pencil already finding the margin of a memorandum. Larch, trial, send 2 engineers to argue. Protocol adjusts itself silently. A secretary in the shadow takes notes in 2 columns, decisions, and promises that must not be allowed to live as gossip. A footman moves a screen half an inch because his eye has learned where the draft will attack a throat, just when a sentence needs to be said. Tai arrives by the rising table, with cups thin as honest argument. No livery crosses the threshold. The contrivance levels rank for a moment, and the conversation runs, not around it, but through it. Potemkin's clothes often refuse to be completely military, a fact the capital enjoyed as anecdote. One boot polished like a threat, the other creased by haste, perhaps true once, perhaps the city's pleasure in making a mind visible as costume. He wears today a compromise between field and court, sash subdued, orders quiet, the wool cut to travel but brushed to obey a chair. He leans forward when she reads a line from a provincial petition. He leans back, with the rare license of these rooms when a thought needs space to find its end without interruption. The talk thickens to policy. He argues for founding towns like chess pieces, rather than like jam jars, staggered to watch each other and linked by roads that don't drown in March. Villages first, he says, if they are honest. Towns made by decree rot from the edges. Towns made by markets feed themselves. She counters. Decrees must exist to be disobeyed into sense. The pencil writes both sentences down. Between them, a workable country emerges. Letters lie open on the smaller desk. One carries the South into the room with a force of its own. His hand, but from another day, urgent and affectionate, a gradient of tone that has to be carried like porcelain. She does not let the paper own the air. Instead, she asks, "Where will the next school stand?" He, quick, "Where the wind falls off the step so chalk does not blow from the slate, in a street that turns the sun at 10, near a well." He has traveled enough to make answers made of weather, not abstraction. The room has its small theater even in private. A map is carried forward, a pin moves, a string finds a distance. The globe turns with the soft rasp that wood makes when it honors oil. He lifts a sealed paper with a caution that says it has heat in it, diplomatic or domestic or both. Not for the chancellery, he says. She does not open it now. She places it under the blotter where the weight is a bronze hand, an old joke between them about keeping the morning down. Rumor outside prefers doors left ajar. In here, caution is both ethics and efficiency. There are no whispered orders to escort a favorite in the night, no doors that open into bedrooms because gossip needs them. There are routes that deny parade the right to interrupt work, and there are chairs that ask rank to sit in the posture of use. When he oversteps, as any strong ally will, the room corrects him better than a reprimand. She looks once at the clock, and he remembers the 1,000 hands the clock commands beyond this calm. He offers, at the end, something like a coda. "A theater," he says, "for the South. Kherson first, then the others. If cities are to stand, they must learn to breathe together." She hears Diderot's echo in that. She hears also the engineer who knows how to build a roof that neither booms in wind nor groans at thaw. "Plans," she says, and the word is both affection and order. Outside, a sleigh passes with runners drawing a single high note like wire. Inside, the lamp steadies, the pencil dries, and the small door that admitted him begins to remember its seam. He rises, bows in the economy this wing teaches, and goes by the route that will not wake ceremony. On the wall beside the disguised door, a panel looks slightly different tonight, darker by a shade, perhaps newly touched by a restorer's hand. It yields if you know it. Behind it lies not a bedchamber, but a strip of passage that runs, improbably, toward music. The theater raised to serve privacy, where curtains learn to move like doors and doors like curtains. The panel breathes. The panel yields, and sound changes from paper's hush to air tuned for voices. You step into a corridor that seems undecided whether it belongs to a house or a ship, tight, purposeful, lit by small lamps that make their own weather. At its end, a door opens to a world composed for listening, the Hermitage Theater, drawn in a classical hand and finished with the cool assurance of geometry. It is not the public opera house with its thunder of fur and orders. It is a private engine, built so a handful of people can breathe together and call it an evening. The room takes you in with stone and curve. The auditorium is a semicircle, its tiers rising like shallow steps of a hillside, faced in smooth stone and dressed in pale, olive-green panels that tame candlelight to civility. Slender columns ring the room, white, fluted, disciplined as a phrase in Latin. Above them, statues keep company, muses and ancients who have learned the trick of looking like both ornament and conscience. The architect, Giacomo Quarenghi, steady in his taste, has made a space that does not gossip. Every line is exact enough to quiet a nervous hand. Sit, and you hear the room before the music. The soft negotiation of silk against stone, a page brushing past with programs on a tray, the test note from a violinist behind the screen, no vanity in it, only duty to pitch. Sconces along the walls wear glass like dew. Their flames are clipped to shape by shades so the audience glows and the stage is kept for revelation. The smell is a civic perfume, beeswax, a ghost of resin from the stage machinery, breath cooling in winter air that has been made patient by stoves hidden where the eye cannot be tempted to think about them. Catherine enters not as spectacle, but as center of gravity. The route here has been brief and invisible. No grand staircase has been asked to earn its keep. She sits where the room proposes the ear should rule the eye, close enough to read a face, far enough to let a speech arrive as public sense rather than private whisper. The dog, who does not care for trumpets but admits strings, curls under the bench where the stone is warmed from within. A nod sets the evening's grammar. The curtain lifts without rustle. Tonight the program is a small opera, one of those French works trimmed to court dimensions, or perhaps a Russian comedy written by a pen that has learned to laugh without cruelty. There will be ballet in the middle, because the body needs to argue what words alone cannot. Costumes rustle in the wings. A flute sings a little river that the basses will turn into ground. The conductor, catching the Empress's eye, bows not to power but to attention. What happens here is not accident. Catherine believed theaters taught a city to keep time together. The discipline of the 8 o'clock bell, the habit of sitting through an argument set to instruments, the applause that waits for a cadence. These are moderate civic virtues disguised as pleasure. In private, the theater does another job. It ventilates a mind after papers and maps have warmed it. Comedy deflates pomposity. A tragic aria trains the nerves to withstand the long line. A pas de deux proves that balance is not a metaphor, but a physics one can practice. Quarenghi's house answers the performers with the courtesy of good acoustics. Speech does not fray before it reaches the last tier. A piano whisper, newly fashionable, travels with an intimacy that forces silence on even the most distracted head. When the heroine turns and says the line that contains tonight's truth, something about constancy perhaps, or the price of haste, the room keeps it whole. A secretary in the shadow writes nothing. Some sentences are better stored in muscle and memory than in ink. Behind the visible stage, a second architecture works. Ropes run in lofts, counterweights wait like patient animals. A scene painted with city roofs slides away to reveal a forest that is a problem of green gauze and practical leaves. The carpenters who keep the platform true are the cousins of the men who tend the rising tables. The same grease comforts both machines. Between acts, a machinist listens for the fatigue in a pulley, the way a physician listens to a chest. The court here is edited. There are favorites, rivals, minds that harmonize, and others that rasp, but they are contained by the room's modesty. A sparkle of orders at one shoulder, then nothing but attention. News moves more slowly when the audience is small. Rumor has to work for its bread. Potemkin, if present tonight, leans the way he leans when a general's speech is shorter than expected. Pleased. An ambassador, granted a place, reads more than he hears and will write to his minister about the taste of a sovereign that prefers measure to glare. Interlude. Dancers. Winter finds its opposite in muscle and breath. A girl crackles across the stage like paper lit. A man lands as softly as a cat on a felt stair. Their steps explain to the room what the day's plans explain to paper, intention carried by discipline. Catherine watches with a collector's comprehension. Line, proportion, placement, and a ruler's instinct for what such grace costs. Years, injuries hidden under silk, the civil act of training the body to be more than unwilling matter. Between scenes, a narrow door opens near the Empress's place, and a board slides out with cups and a thin slice of something sugared to keep the mind awake. The service is the theater's quiet joke on appetite. Nothing breaks the spell. A page bends, sets a cup, vanishes. The musicians turn the pages of their parts with a sound like moths changing direction. In the pit, a bassoon whispers the old rumor that winter is comic if you put enough wind to work against it. Plays here have to pass two tests. They must fit the room, and they must fit the hour. Catherine tolerates sharpness if it bites pretension rather than kindness. She will forgive a plot that cheats so long as the meter keeps its promise. Sometimes she asks to hear a scene again, not as monarch, but as steward of a small city of minds. Sometimes she cuts a piece from her own pen into the program, signing it with a modesty that her friends find mischievous. The final chord hangs like a small moon and goes out. Applause is a clean, brief rain. No curtain calls that turn gratitude into debt. No ovations that mistake heat for light. Musicians bow once. The stage exhales scenery back into the dark loft, where it will sleep on ropes. Conversation resumes as the room's second act. Low, neighborly, specific. No shouting weather of the public opera. A dancer, passing behind the screen, coughs delicately into her elbow. A violinist flexes fingers that have argued with gut and winter all evening and won. Catherine rises, not to be seen, but to leave the room intact. She has the trick, learned from statecraft and theater both, of ending with a line that keeps the night standing. "Let the comic be copied for the girls," she says to a secretary, thinking of a school where laughter will be rare and useful. "And send oranges to the pit, to credit the instrument's lungs with something more than thanks." The discreet door receives her as it did when she arrived. The corridor beyond has cooled. A draft carries the iron tang of snow and the faint animal smell of wool cloaks waiting on pegs. A page lifts a lamp. The flame gathers the stone into a small republic of light. From the far spine of the palace, a bell speaks the hour to those who listen for duty instead of delight. On the other side of these panels, the building changes key again, from music's measured time to the slow meter of protection. A watchman on the quayside strikes metal to metal in his round, and somewhere in the under corridors a stove door ticks as it settles for the long, careful night. At the foot of the next stair, a leather bucket and a brass lantern wait, like two nouns in a sentence the city never wants to finish. Night in the palace completes itself with a final, practical liturgy. After music and talk, after the last lamp in the theater's corridor is pinched, the building returns to its oldest discipline, not to burn. St. Petersburg is a city that learned early to fear flame. Wood, wind, and winter make a treacherous republic. The Winter Palace, with its miles of paneling and silks, answers by drilling caution into habit until caution becomes atmosphere. Start in the under corridors where leather buckets hang in ranks like docile animals and sand stands in barrels by every stove mouth. A sign, written in a neat clerk's hand, fixes the night order, which flues to be checked at the first hour, which doors to be wedged open for draft, which lanterns to be shaded green so the eye stays kind after long dark. The watch captain, boots felted, cloak worn thin at the shoulder by years of leaning into weather, calls the names in a tone that is more ledger than trumpet. Each man touches his halberd or hook, not for ceremony, but to confirm weight and balance. Stoves are this world's lungs, tiled in Dutch blues and whites that lie sweet to the eye, while heat works in paragraphs rather than shouts. The sweep has been earlier, soot bag knotted like a miser's purse. Now the stove tender listens with his knuckles against the tile. The tick he wants is even, the draw steady. He opens the small iron door and reads the fire the way a physician reads a face. Too hungry ablaze and silk on the far wall will dry to danger. Too starved and walls will sweat, and mildew will find books before spring teaches the windows to breathe again. He nudges with a spoon of iron, closes, latches, and draws the little slide that makes the flame obey the room rather than the chimney. Up in the anterooms that buffer the state suites, wicks on wall lamps are trimmed to a hair above prudence, and shades are turned so light falls to the floor, not the hangings. A boy with a ladder moves silently from sconce to sconce, a scrap of yesterday's Gazette, and a finger's breadth of vinegar, making glass bright with a smell that cleans the mind as well as the cup. Behind him, an older man checks the drip catchers, little cups under each candlestick that turn hazard into habit. He flicks one. It gives the right, dull ring of metal that has work to do. The watch moves on, room by room, touching edges where danger likes to begin. Portieres are raised a hand's width from the floor, so a rogue coal cannot find a hem. Ashes cool under lids stamped with the arms. The lids are more grammar than pride. They teach the youngest hand that fire is a noun only when named and contained. Windows are tested for the breath that creeps even in stone houses. A roll of wool at the sill answers the river's long attempt to come indoors at night. In a writing closet, a quill that still glistens is laid aside, sand shaken over ink that would, left wet, print the shape of a law on a sleeve. Outside, the Neva sounds like iron being bent. A watchman on the quay strikes metal on metal, 2 slow blows, pause, 2 again, to tell any listener with duty that the hour stands where it should. His breath plumes, drifts, vanishes. Across the square, a sentry lifts his cloak and stamps once. You can hear the frost answer his boot. The sound is a signature on the city's promise to keep itself. Within, rounds continue with clocks and chalk. In this century, many watchmen carry a tally, a board pricked with stations. Some palaces give a lead seal to be clipped at each point, others a key to turn in a box so a morning officer can read the route like music. The Winter Palace has its variants, but the principle holds, vigilance made legible. The watch captain pauses at a cupboard where the night orders book lies open, entries dated, initialed, flues X and Y cleared at 3rd hour, North Passage lamp replaced, crack observed in tile by the third window, to be shown to the mason by daylight. If a later century forgets such exactness, it will remember by loss. But for now, the neatness of the line steadies sleep. Tension rises, not in panic, but in the shared knowledge that winter magnifies small faults. A servant, passing too close to a candle, leaves a thread of singe in the air. The under-housekeeper descends upon it like weather, hands it to the bucket's shadow, and the smell dies into vinegar and wool. A faint, suspect warmth is felt near a wainscot, where a stove backs a wall. The panel is touched, then the tile. A hand tests the join, the way a violinist tests tuning, gently, with the ear rather than the will. The watch captain nods. "Open the ash door," he says, and the iron answers docilely. Heat shows where the chimney elbow forgot humility. A board is fetched, a wedge placed, the draft corrected. No alarm bell wakes the square, no rumor earns its bread. The correction is ordinary, which is to say, life-saving. In the kitchens, discipline has its own stanza. Coals are drowned line by line, fat is scraped. A boy scours copper until the air turns penny bright around him. Lanterns here wear tin cones that throw light down, and refuse the temptation to tell the rafters stories. A ledger notes bones for broth, peel for candied orange, sawdust for the ice cellar floor. The ice itself, carved and carried from the river with the pride of a harvest, rests under straw like a stored moon. It will outlast this night and hold March steady for fish and cream when roads turn to porridge. Fire is not the only hazard. Thieves prefer dark and fine wood. Snow invites roofs to sag. Cold grinds locks until mercy is begged of oil. The rounds answer in countermeasures. Hinges are kissed with tallow. Pegs for cloaks are checked so a heavy wet thing cannot pull a nail out and begin a fall that will pull a candelabrum with it. Doors are set so they can be thrown wide in one motion if smoke writes its first sentence. The watchmen own the alphabet of disaster so that it will not spell itself. At intervals, the captain stands at a window and looks out where the square and the river divide the world into grammar, simple enough for a man to guard. The moon makes the gilding on the facade cold as fish skin. The colonnades hold their breath. He listens for the single sound he must never hear without answering. 3 fast notes on a bell, repeated, running like fire itself. Tonight he hears only the city's old song. Iron on iron, paw on snow, the creak of a signboard where a tavern counts the hours in its own measures. He writes all well with a hand that has learned not to tempt fate with flourish. By the time the east carries a paler dark, the palace's skin has been checked and found intact. Fire buckets stand like nouns that did not need to be conjugated. Sand sleeps. Stoves exhale the paragraphs that have kept paper from cracking, and hands from stiffening into worse decisions. A maid with felt slippers crosses a passage and cracks the door of a small gallery. The air inside tastes faintly of tallow and varnish, the night's honest residue. In that smell, the next part of the day announces itself. Collections have been safe under candle smoke, but smoke, even when well-mannered, writes on varnish and silk. At first light, men with soft brushes and women with lint-free cloth will enter like weather turned gentler. They will beat nothing and disturb no crackle of winter air. They will coax from frames the dust the night brought and check the edges of canvases for the first whisper of a lift. The key turns in the gallery door. At first light, the palace breathes a quieter industry. The watch has given the night back to the day. Now the rooms of looking claim their share. Before courtiers find their mirrors and secretaries their pens, the galleries fill with the small, exact sounds of care. The whisper of feathers on gilt, the crisp exhale of linen drawn once across a frame, the soft chuck of a key easing a stretcher bar toward tension. Candle smoke, the tax pleasure levies on winter, must be paid and then remitted daily so that eyes can keep their promises. Open the door, and you meet a doctrine of dust. A woman with a goose feather sweeps down a frame's inner edge, never across a painting's skin. Her feather is clean. Its job is not heroism, but prevention. A man follows with a square of tightly woven linen, folded to present a fresh face for each pass. He runs it along the top of the molding, where soot would settle into residence if allowed 2 days in a row. No one here beats anything. Vibration is the enemy of corners where age has planted hairline truths. The air is tuned. Stoves have been set to paragraphs, not shouts. In their crowns, small pans of water steam just enough to keep winter from turning canvas into glass. Too dry, and ground layers tighten like a fist. too damp, and linen remembers it was once plant and tries to move like river grass. The room's custodians, some trained in workshops attached to the academy, some trained by their hands, read humidity and symptoms, a panel that clicks softly at dawn, a drawn thread at the edge of a canvas, a varnish that has begun to bloom with a ghostly haze. Varnish, that transparent fiction between paint and air. Here, candle smoke writes upon it each night in microscopic script. Here, daylight reveals what it has written. A restorer, sleeves rolled, opens his leather roll, bone folder, hog bristle brushes cut thinner than breath, cotton wrapped around fingers, a glass vial with a spirit that smells like a promise and a risk. He touches first, barely, in a margin where sky gives no offense if a mistake occurs. He tests a solvent as a physician tests a pulse. If the varnish softens and lifts, he smiles with the caution of a man stepping onto winter ice. If the pigment mutters under the cotton, he stops. Better a brown daylight than a bright regret. The century argues about cleaning, Paris embraces brilliance, Rome remembers patina. In St. Petersburg, a northern prudence prevails. The Empress wishes to see, she does not wish to erase. Not all patients are faces and skies. Still life with brass and bread, one of those Dutch sermons in the eloquence of ordinary things, has stretched a little on its frame. In a corner, a tiny wedge, a key, has worked loose where a stretcher meets itself. A gentle tap with a wooden tool opens the angle by a hair, and the linen relaxes like a man whose boot has been unlaced. The restorer notes it in a small book. Keys taken up, third bay, north wall. He writes in the neat hand of a man who expects posterity to be nosy and is happy to help. On a long table lie portfolios strapped in leather, engravings after masterworks, architectural plans, cartoons for tapestries, sheets where a student's hand has tried to learn the curve of a wrist from a living model and instead found honesty. Hands are washed before opening. Breath is kept from the page to spare the paper's sizing a slow assault of acid winter. A clerk turns leaves with a bone folder so that corners do not dog-ear their futures. Daniel Solander's neat box has begun to appear in Europe. Here, portfolios still suffice. But the idea that flat paper deserves a coffin that keeps out light and appetite is in the room like a rumor that will soon be law. Light itself is rationed and angled. Blinds are set to strike canvases high, not head-on. Mirrors lend glow without giving heat. In a few rooms, an argan lamp is tested, a clear flame with a surprising steadiness, its glass chimney wiped with vinegar and a rag until the light remembers why it exists. The lamp is a foreigner admitted under conditions, kept far from varnish, placed where it favors a frame's scrollwork more than a painting's flesh. Watched. Frames are their own country. Gessoed and gilded, they haunt the edge between protection and temptation. A gilder, hands dusted with chalk, lifts a loose leaf as if lifting breath and floats it onto bowl red as a winter berry. He speaks softly to the air because leaf is shy. A cough would turn a month's work into glitter on a floor. He will later burnish with an agate until the line holds a sun no candle can supply, then step back to be sure the gold does not outtalk the picture it is paid to serve. On a high ladder, a man adjusts cords from which a large canvas hangs. Hanging is a truce between gravity and will. Too tight, and the wall becomes a drum that makes every footfall a threat. Too loose, and a draft turns a masterpiece into a sail. He sets the distance with a ruler stained by years and an instinct that is older than rulers. When the picture stops quivering at a sigh, he is done. He steps down into a silence that the room gives as payment. Inventory is the other morning labor. Numbers, titles, subjects, measurements, columns that turn color and story into government. 24 by 36 Verschachs, a clerk says, catching the empire's old inches by habit. After Rubens, he adds, with a shrug that protects truth without prosecuting pride. A second clerk checks against a list copied from Grimm's correspondence. A third notes that a certain still life catalogued as with lemons contains oranges as well. The world corrects itself in fruit before it does in borders. Catherine will read the columns later, not as a miser counts coins, but as a general counts companies, to know what she can deploy to educate, to persuade, to comfort, to argue. The galleries also keep time for the city's brains. Falconet's pupil visits to draw a hand he cannot invent. A young officer, excused from parade by frostbitten feet, studies architecture on paper and learns that a cornice can be disciplined without being dull. A girl from a school sustained by the Empress's stubborn charity, letters for 6, then 60, copies a face and finds that shading demands patience in every other task. The Hermitage has not yet opened itself as a public elbow-to-elbow promenade, but minds come, chosen in quiet, and leave with a scent on them like varnish. Patience, attention, proportion. The morning's last task is caution. A conservator runs a blunt fingernail along the seam where canvas meets frame. No shiver, good. He lifts the painting slightly, feels with the other hand whether the lower edge clears the ledge cleanly. No grit to grind, good. He tastes the room, a figure of speech and not. The air near a window is a degree crueler. A woman at the door pauses, listening for a sound that does not belong. Drip, crack, mouse. Only the stove's contented tick replies. For all this order, the galleries live under history, the way ships live under weather beyond the chart. Fires happen in capitals. Regimes turn. The palace knows both. In a high corner, smoke once smudged a plaster cornice and was coaxed back into whiteness. In the ledger, a hand changes in 1762 and the script stiffens, then loosens as new habit learns itself. Canvas and panel remember nothing. People remember everything. A page appears in the doorway, breath making a small cloud that breaks over the threshold and dissolves. He holds a folded paper, seal fresh and official. His voice is pitched for a room that protects pictures from wind and rumor alike. From the guards' barracks, he says, and the word guards puts a tension in the air, as quickly as a draft puts a shutter to work. A disturbance, quiet for now, but the captain requests instruction. Feathers still, linen halts mid-fold. The conservator sets down his key and closes his leather roll with a thread that makes one soft knot. On the far wall, a woman in an old Italian painting looks out past the room, with the fatigue of someone who has seen power change under her window before breakfast. The page's words enter the gallery like a draft. A disturbance, quiet for now, he says, and the last feather stills above guilt. Winter capitals learn early that noise is not the only warning. There is also the tuned hush that follows a rumor into barracks. Catherine does not let the sentence breed. "Thank you," she says, and the boy, relieved to have carried his bundle of air without spilling it, is gone. Rooms have memories. The Hermitage keeps the smell of varnish. The Winter Palace keeps the echo of 1762. Catherine's reign began with a door opening at a dangerous hour, and a city waking to the hoofbeats of allegiance. She remembers, and the palace remembers, how a woman wrapped in a riding habit was lifted onto a horse in the gray between night and day. How the Ismailovsky men crowded close, shoulders making a wall warmer than summer, when she stood on a drum and let a sergeant's hand steady her waist. She wore a sash that turned the soldier's green into the nation's color. An icon was held up like a seal. Oaths, which are only air until someone believes them, turned into bread. The march to the troops, the oath at Kazan Church, the Senate's voices finding their new tents, these are the palace's quiet catechism when wood creaks in frost. She remembers, too, what cannot be turned into paint without lying. A husband deposed. A death at Rapsha afterward under circumstances the papers do not settle. Whispers she has outlived by not feeding them. The palace keeps the prudent version, doors that do not open into bedrooms from corridors. Stairs that let a ruler appear where the rumor thinks she is not. Corridors that elide parade when parade is not the right instrument. In the ledger of 1762, the script changes hands. The rooms learn to ask that decisions be made where the pen and the map touch, not where gossip keeps its shop. "Which barracks?" she asks the gallery attendant, who has listened without daring to breathe. "Preobrazhensky, Your Majesty." Alexeyev, the captain, pledges quiet. Preobrazhensky, oldest of the guard, proud of a history that begins when Peter the Great was still learning how to be the sentence that would change a country's grammar. Pride is useful when harnessed, dangerous when bored, volatile when underpaid. She had learned that the guards must be fed in coin and in respect, rotated like crops, and given theaters and schools so that the city's timekeeping entered their wrists. Tonight's trouble might be nothing more than a quarrel over arrears or a winter bottle. It might be less than rumor and more than peace. One does not guess aloud. Orders move in the low voice these rooms require. "No drums," she says. "Double the lamps in the guard rooms. Darkness multiplies noise." To the under-housekeeper, "Have the small door to the passage opened. I will not use the grand stair." To the secretary, "Bring the list of the men promoted last quarter. I will not speak a name, and then hear that his file says otherwise." To the steward of linens, the sash. He knows which. The broad blue that reads as lineage in a city that keeps symbols as if they were tools. It lies folded in a narrow drawer under a green baize, the fabric smelling faintly of cedar and winter storage. On her way from varnish to square, she passes the hinge spaces that have collected this narrative. The map room, with its steadiness. The porcelain cabinet that taught the eye to measure heat. The narrow stair where the handrail remembers hands that meant to do something quickly, but not rashly. She does not walk faster than sense. The spaniel, certain now that the knight will ask for feet rather than sleep, follows until a page catches him by the chest and crooks him into a cushion with a promise and a biscuit. In the passage that runs behind the green drawing room, the night watchman stands aside with a bow that is all duty. His halberd's blade is hooded, his lantern wears green glass. He has the good watchman's talent for being both present and invisible. All lamps trimmed, Majesty, he murmurs. Buckets full, sand dry as meal. The words are small, their assurance is large. Fire magnifies mischance. Tonight wants no allies. Silence organizes the next corridor. From the guard court, the sound of men waiting is unmistakable. Leather that has been kept clean by boredom. Scabbards held so they will not kiss stone. Breath released slowly in air that writes it down. She pauses in an anteroom to let the night read her before she lets the men do it. A chamberlain, gray with experience, says, "Captain Alexeyev begs the favor that your majesty not take cold." She lifts a hand and he falls silent, not scolded, but returned to his rank. The architecture corrects him as surely as a word can. She does not intend to harangue. In 1762, speeches were for squares and cathedrals. In the aftermath, governance is a craft that belongs in rooms that fit a voice. But soldiers, old soldiers especially, are eased by being counted. She steps into the court, where lamps make their own small suns and snow confers quiet authority on anything that stands still in it. Faces lift as if the cold had given them string. The men are not drunk. The relief runs through her like heat. "Good evening," she says, without throat. "I have been told there is noise where there should be sleep." The captain steps forward, his breath a white comma. "Your Majesty, a quarrel over arrears and a bottle. No treason. The names are written." He holds out a folded paper, and she does not take it. "Keep your lists," she says. "Pay on time, judge without haste, and remind your men that in this weather, a night in a cell kills more quickly than a year of bad sermons." A few mouths twitch. She adds calmly, "We remember what oaths are for. They keep a city standing when the river thinks otherwise." The word oaths pulls an old thread through the air. The oldest men straighten uneasily, not from guilt, but from memory. Some were boys in 1762, watching from the edges when the new sovereign crossed a threshold and became their grammar. One, who still carries his years in his shoulders, lifts 2 fingers to his brow, and they all follow, not as parade but as household. She keeps it short. "Tomorrow you will drill at the hour. Tomorrow the paymaster will stand with his book, and your names will be spoken clearly. Tonight you will sleep. Brown spirits are for thaw." A ripple of something like laughter, modest and permitted, moves along the line. She does not turn her back until the captain has dismissed them with the right voice, and she has felt the court begin to empty of tension, the way a stove exhales the last of a day. Back inside, the corridor gives heat back to the hands. A page takes the sash, the under-housekeeper takes the lamp and trims it without looking. The secretary, who has the lists ready in case the night had turned formal, tucks them back into his portfolio with the satisfaction of a man who has been spared writing a bad paragraph into the book of order. In a small closet beyond, a broken seal lies under a bronze hand on the desk, Potemkin's earlier packet, set aside during the letters. She lifts it now and finds, not scandal, but plans. Elevations for barracks windows that do not rattle the mind to pieces in winter wind. A drill schedule that turns boredom into competence. A margin note. Men paid predictably fight less with ghosts. She smiles, not at romance, but at the way a room can persuade wood and paper to cooperate across distances. She means to sleep, but on the panel near the night stair, oak, plain, unremarkable, something has darkened along the grain. The under-housekeeper frowns. A draft? A stove sulking? Or only the shadow of a story the palace tells itself when the river creaks? She raises the lamp, and the seam of the panel takes a breath. Lift the lamp, and what looks like a stain becomes a story. Grain darkened where a hand has always found the latch. Time in palaces does not pass, it layers. Catherine's geometry still lies under paint and plaster, the way a river keeps its old beds beneath the current. What has survived is not a single room untouched, but a pattern that refused to be erased even when fire, revolution, and war wrote in large strokes. Begin with fire. In 1837, winter's old enemy reached the Winter Palace itself. A blaze began in the roofing near the small church. The alarm ran the building like a bad dream. Guards smashed frozen hydrants. Engines wheezed. Wind took sparks and argued for more. The great public interiors, halls that had been rehearsing ceremony for a century, suffered worst. In the frantic days that followed, architects and craftsmen moved like surgeons. Vasily Stasov and those under him set about a reconstruction that would become a second authorship of the palace. Ornament changed. Some lines straightened into a sterner century. Colors cooled and grew monumental. But even as staterooms learned new sentences, the backstage grammar endured. Service passages, tucked in thicknesses of wall, still ran where heat must move, messages must flow, and a sovereign, any sovereign, must pass unseen from thought to act. The habit of privacy survived fire, because fire had never needed to notice it. The Hermitage annexes fared better. The theater, with its stone calm and Quaranqui's restrained classicism, kept its voice. The galleries where Catherine had learned to rest her eye held their poise. The little contrivances, dumbwaiters, hatches, speaking tubes, were repaired, rearranged, sometimes forgotten, and then refound when a wall was opened for a new wire or pipe, and an old intention blinked in the dust. In inventories and builder's notes, you see the pulse. Retained a passage, reopened a door in former line, lift shaft, boards renewed. None of this is romance, it is carpentry's memory. History shifted again in 1917, and the building, by then half palace, half museum, learned to survive new kinds of hurry. The storming of the Winter Palace, later painted as thunder, was in the night itself a messier weather. Red guards, sailors, a few shots, a great deal of running on staircases whose acoustics turn any boot into a drum. The provisional government, gathered near the Malachite room, was arrested in a small dining room close by. Looting burst and was partly checked. A famous wine cellar became a parable of human thirst and the difficulty of improvising virtue in a city that had run out of patience. Yet even here, the hidden geographies did their old work. Routes meant for discretion helped curators and staff reach what needed guarding. Doors that looked like wall slowed people who thought crowds open everything. After the revolution, the most radical act was quiet, turning more and more of the palace into a museum and keeping it that way. The sovereign's solitude became, paradoxically, a civic trust. Where a single gaze had once arranged walls, a public gaze now learned how to behave. The mechanical dining suite, if not intact in Catherine's fittings, lingered as plan and as demonstration. Drawings, bills, scarred floorboards that show where a circle once kissed wood. The logic itself interpreted for visitors who have never eaten without being served and still understand the seduction of conversation unbroken by clatter. War returned as siege. In 1941, when Leningrad tightened its belt to a last notch, the Hermitage undertook a removal that still reads like a moral document. Crates were built at a fever pitch to metronomes of artillery. Frames were left hanging like empty windows to say that absence was not abandonment. Trains pulled east toward the Urals with paintings cushioned in straw, and lists copied twice, thrice, in hands that shook from cold and from duty. Those who remained slept in cellars under galleries. Cats patrolled, snow powdered through broken panes and was swept with the same gentleness they used on varnish. The theater, in the blackout, became a place to prove that breath could keep time even when the city starved. When the trains brought art home again, empty frames closed their mouths, and rooms relearned their voices. The survival you can see is sometimes crooked. A corridor doglegs where a wall added after the fire refused to forget the old alignment. A stair lands half a step short of symmetry because the night stair had first claim. A door's brass is rubbed where fingers insist there is a seam. The small rooms, map cabinets, reading closets, the hinged spaces where paper met appetite and appetite was taught to behave, have been repurposed again and again, but their proportions still speak. A table sits where a mechanism once breathed. A guard leans on a rail that was polished by a hand you have just followed. Not every survival is wood and brick. Habits persist. Light, trimmed to working, not glaring. green shades over lamps that turn attention into a lake rather than a mirror, screens set not to show off fabric but to direct draft. A custodian, answering a question, lowers his voice automatically in the galleries as if conversation might smudge paint. A conservator taps a stretcher key with that same inherited tenderness you watched in Part 14. The museum's protocols are descendants of a sovereign's preferences. Clarity before glitter, proportion before parade, privacy when thinking is the work at hand. Walk today along the riverfront, and you can read the layers if you know the script. Rastrelli's Baroque splendor still puts out its chest to meet the Neva. Stasov's reconstruction keeps the chest breathing after flame. Quarenghi's theater remains a sentence in good Latin. The 19th century added weight. The 20th added scars and then patience. Inside, one can stand in a room that is Catherine's only in intention and still feel her hour. The cabinet where the eye wakes, the map room where distance becomes duty, the annex where the table taught conversation to trust itself. The dog is gone. The spaniel exists now only in paint and in a floorboard worn to a curve that suggests a favorite corner. The pencil in the margin has turned to catalogs, labels, audio guides. But the line that ran through these parts, work before spectacle, a house that allows a mind to cross from paper to picture to policy without raising its temperature, still threads the building. Even crowds, when they are good, participate. A hush one can hear when a Rembrandt's face takes custody of 100 strangers at once. A patience one can measure when a guide lowers her hand instead of her voice and the group leans in. There is one more survival, the most difficult to exhibit. The conviction that collecting is a form of rule, over oneself first, then over rooms, and only then, cautiously, over others. Catherine's private empire, the hours she sovereigned when the day allowed, left its fossils in hinges and habits. To see them is to understand a kind of power that hid itself in good carpentry and better lighting. The lamp in your hand lowers. The seam that looked like stain becomes only wood again. From the far side of the corridor, a current of cool air carries the river's iron and a faint sweetness of wax. The palace's two verbs, preserving and explaining, at work together. Somewhere a clock counts a quarter, somewhere a page turns a key in a door that a visitor will read as wall. One more door remains, and beyond it the question that museums ask when bedrooms become galleries and private appetites become public instruction. What exactly was Catherine trying to keep alive? And what, in keeping it alive, did she bequeath to us? What Catherine tried to keep alive and what we inherit is simpler and harder than legend. The discipline of attention. Not pomp, which burns fast, but a way of arranging rooms, hours, and senses so that power will think before it speaks. The hidden palace, the service corridors, the night stair, the cabinets of porcelain and maps, the Hermitage's measured light, was not a maze built for intrigue. It was a machine tuned to make consideration possible. Follow the line once more, from door to desk. A narrow latch polished by habit admits you to the morning papers, where margins mattered more than oratory. A warmed passage carries you to porcelain, where the eye learned honesty before the hand signed laws. A turn along the river delivers you to galleries where conversation among paintings trained judgment to prefer proportion over glare. A disguised panel leads to a theater that practiced timekeeping as civic virtue. A short descent finds the rising tables where speech could travel without interruption. A curl of stair returns you to fabrics and light that defended the nerves against a northern latitude's impatience. These were not luxuries. They were Catherine's instruments, as necessary as seals and sabers. Her legacy lives in the museum that inherited her annex and then engulfed the palace, not only in collections thick with old skies and human faces, but in practices that turn looking into citizenship. The Hermitage today is elbow to elbow with strangers, not chosen minds by invitation, yet the old ethic survives in the way a room calms a crowd. Green lampshades still coax attention into a lake rather than a mirror. Stewards still move dust without violence. Conservators still decide, in winter, to leave a brown daylight rather than risk a bright regret. The public does, imperfectly but sincerely, what one woman once did privately. It enters, quiets, and tries to see. Catherine's rooms bequeath another habit to the modern visitor, to distrust spectacle when it arrives without structure. The facades remain magnificent. The river still throws them a hard, clean light. But the most consequential spaces were small and sober, and they taught a kind of skepticism with warmth in it. Porcelain sitting in a light that does not flatter teaches that taste can be rigorous. Maps pinned to a wall teach that distance is a solvable argument. A theater that refuses thunder teaches that breath shared is politics in slow motion. The Emperor's rooms often promised eternity. The Empress's smaller rooms insisted on tomorrow morning. Consider the story's rougher edges, the places where admiration must step carefully. Catherine built a refuge for thought, inside a state that could be harsh. She corresponded with minds that preached liberty, while she governed a country where freedom moved by inches. She wrote against torture in a century that still kept it in its memory like a bad habit. She extended borders with a firmness that later paint would euphemize. The rooms do not absolve, they reveal. In their plain lit geometry, one sees how a life can be argued between appetite and restraint, speed and revision. She chose, again and again, to put her intellect inside carpentry that checked it, not as punishment, but as prudence. Her private empire, these hours, these hinge spaces, made public consequences. A school for girls, first 6, then 60, because a margin note said, begin. A theater schedule that taught a capital to arrive at the same hour. Galleries that pulled taste away from enameled fantasies towards the stubborn weight of hands, faces, fruit, sky. Diplomacy performed without a throne in a room hung with examples of human candor. Dinners arranged by rope so that conversation could walk farther than ceremony. You can map reforms and purchases across a calendar. You can also map them across a floor plan. Policy's biography is sometimes architectural. And then there is what survived on the underside of history. Fire remade ceilings, regimes repainted rhetoric, siege emptied frames and returned them. Yet the backstage logic proved more durable than ornament. Parallel routes for heat and news. Thresholds that slow noise, doors that look like wall. When the 19th century rebuilt, it kept the arteries. When the 20th evacuated, it moved along them. When the 21st files past Rembrandt, it profits from them without seeing them. The hidden rooms were designed for one sovereign. They serve millions. That is the museum's most radical feat, to convert a private instrument into a public right. If you find yourself on the Neva under a sky like pewter and then blue, you can still feel the temperature change from parade to use. The grand enfilade will raise your chin. The Hermitage will lower your pulse. Somewhere a tiled stove ticks with the old paragraph heat. Somewhere a conservator taps a stretcher key with a library's worth of caution. In a quiet cabinet, a cup catches winter daylight and returns it as patience. In a theater of measured stone, a chord decides when to let go. And in a corridor that thinks like a handrail, a seam in the panel shows where fingers have agreed for 2.5 centuries that thinking sometimes needs a shorter route than ceremony allows. Legacy is an untidy word. It tugs at myth and at logistics. Catherine's bequest, seen from these rooms, is not a set of maxims sealed in wax. It is a practice one can imitate. Arrange your day so that seeing precedes judging. Build spaces, however modest, that let concentration defeat spectacle. Keep a theater, literal or metaphorical, where breath is disciplined into common time. Attend to fire and draft as carefully as to rhetoric. Let correspondence challenge you, but never hire it as your conscience. And when rumor bangs on the grand door, keep a smaller one that opens onto reason. The palace still has places where the grain is darkened by use. Brass still remembers fingers. A list still hangs somewhere backstage, pricked with the night's rounds and the day's repairs. Outside, the river keeps its old beds beneath the current. Inside, attention keeps its channels beneath the paint. A visitor lingers before a portrait, reads in the mouth fatigue and cleverness, and for a moment, the room remakes itself into the working cabinet of a woman who preferred to underline a verb rather than declaim an adjective. She is gone. The spaniel sleeps now, only in oil and legend. But when winter gathers on the quay and light climbs the river, and the facade tries its old theater on a new morning, a hand inside the museum lifts a green shade. A page turns a key, a feather finds gilt, and the building does what she designed it to do. It makes time for thought. On a deep windowsill, the glass still shows the wavy memory of the hand that spun it. Beyond, the Neva tightens into a sheet that will crack in spring with a sound like pages turning. Inside, a door that looks like wall waits for the next mind that needs a shorter way from looking to law.